Long before the first latty stones were fashioned, just 1,000 years ago, an early, mysterious group of people had settled in the Marianas about 1500 BC.
Sea gypsies.
Sea nomads. These are Austronesian-speaking people that are sailing all over Southeast Asia.
Where did these settlers come from?
My grandfathers, he says that we traveled, we migrate from India. Some of them may be coming from the Philippines, Malaysia, or Thailand, or Indonesia.
Not really sure.
We definitely did not come from Europe.
A lot of them must have come from the Philippines.
The first settlers in the Marianas arrived about 1500 BC, archaeologists tell us.
To show you over here is one of the oldest sites we found so far, right at the ancient shoreline of its time at 3,500 years ago. At that time, the ocean was right about here, and people were living right on that ancient water line, probably in houses raised on stilts. This site was first occupied about 1500 BC, so for the first 500 years they were living right on the edge of the water. These seem to be the kinds of places where the earliest settlers were attracted. You know, that they would come to these kinds of shallow water protected lagoons because they had the kinds of food resources they wanted, perhaps water resources nearby and other things.
Of course they stayed close to the shore because most of their protein for the day was being caught from the sea. But they also, you know, had a water well, the fresh water that they needed to find.
These shoreline settlements began very early, centuries before seafarers brought their trademark lapita pottery to other islands of the Pacific.
At that time, 3,500 years ago, no one else lived out in the remote Pacific. It was only in the Mariana Islands that we find a few sites.
The Marianas were inhabited initially, first out of all of Micronesia.
Where did these settlers come from? In the past, most believe that the seafarers who first settled the Marianas came from somewhere in Southeast Asia. But the evidence today points to a more specific location. One clue is offered by the old pottery remains found at the settlement sites. That early type of decorated pottery at 3,500 years ago
was found only in the northern through central Philippines. And you just don't see it anywhere else.
The fragments of pottery found is from a type called Marianas redware.
These are bowls of, different shapes and sizes, but in the Marianas they're, about that big, about 20 centimeter diameter are the largest of these early red slipped pottery.
The earliest pottery is redware, but it's very well made redware, very thin.
This is lime-impressed pottery, and that's a solid archaeological tie we have with Luzon.
But pottery is not the only clue pointing to a link between the Marianas and Luzon. Some of the ancient ornaments found in the Marianas are remarkably similar to those in the Philippines.
The ear pendant, it was identical to what was found in one of the archaeological sites in northern Philippines. Almost same size, same design.
Then, too, there is a similarity of the languages in the Philippines with Chamorro. Both are much older than the other languages in the Pacific.
Chamorro is very similar to the grammar of the northern Philippines.
Linguistically, it's very clear. The older parts of the Chamorro language are related to the northern through central Philippines. And because of the unique things in the Chamorro language, the kinds of sounds and the phonology that you can make in the Chamorro language that are not made in other languages, and the way the grammar works, Chamorro language is broken off from the Austronesian family at that very early period.
But there are other similarities in the two language groups as well.
Our word for ear in the Philippines is talinga or tainga, and over here it's talanga.
We have talanga in Chamorro, and it's talinga in Tagalog. Everybody uses mata.
We also say mata, the eyes. Kamay, and over here they say kanay, hand. Number 5, lima.
Everybody uses ngipin, teeth. You have ulu, which is also in Chamorro, ulu for head. In Taiwan, their word for hanum in Chamorro is water. Their word for water is ganum.
Road in Tagalog, they say daan. And over here, they say chalan.
DNA studies today seem to support an early link with the Philippines.
Well, mitochondrial DNA is a part of the DNA that comes strictly from the maternal side. A direct line going back in time strictly through the mother's line. Mitochondrial DNA evidence points to a clear founding population, probably around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago.
The Chamorro lineages, the male and the female, have unique signatures, especially the mitochondrial, in the female, and those are not found in the other parts of the remote Pacific, but they are found in the Philippines and they are found in Indonesia, and that's very much in alignment with the linguistic and archaeological picture.
The first settlers in the Marianas were part of a movement that began in Taiwan. We now know that Taiwan is the homeland of the Austronesian languages, those spoken throughout the Pacific.
What were they doing in Taiwan 5,000 years ago? Something like this. They were growing rice and millet. They had domesticated dogs. They made fancy pottery. They also had little knives made out of shell, item E, that they could have used for harvesting rice. By about 2000 BC, the pottery in Taiwan, especially southeastern Taiwan, becomes a rather bright painted red.
The migration to the Marianas from the northern Philippines would have involved a long voyage into the prevailing trade winds to settle a part of the Pacific that was then unknown. It would have meant a voyage of over 1,000 miles eastward, the first such exploratory voyage into the Pacific.
In the case of the Marianas, it's more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest place that was inhabited at that time at about 1500 BC.
It wasn't just fishermen floating around chasing fish. It was far more planned than that. There had to be some women, obviously. They probably got in a canoe one day with all their sort of young men and young women, and off they went, sailing for a few months across the Kuroshio Current, and they must have hit the northern Marianas or somewhere purely by chance.
The movement of that current leads up and into the Marianas. Whether you're coming up from down south or from up north, it brings you into the Marianas area.
Why did they leave home in the first place? We are not entirely sure why the voyagers would have sailed off to explore the unknown.
Motivations for these earliest sea crossing migrations are wonderfully, interesting, and we will never answer that 100%. But some of the ideas are about just natural curiosity and wanting to explore. There's a need for more coastal resources. Could have to do with the theory that anthropologists call primogeniture, meaning the firstborn children inherit, all of the wealth and land and other resources and status in a family, and then the younger siblings don't inherit anything and they are better off leaving. Escaping warfare, religious persecution, environmental catastrophes like a famine or other things.
As Pacific historians have pointed out, it was safer to sail upwind because the return home was faster and easier if no land was found.
For the Marianas, the interesting thing is that there must have been some planning involved in this first settlement, because it was a successful settlement of a number of sites on a few different islands, men and women, obviously, otherwise they couldn't reproduce. They brought this culture with them and plants and other things. So this is a planned voyage.
Where did these seafarers first settle when they arrived in the Marianas?
In Saipan, we have the site where we are right now, which is Chugao. Also on this side of the island is Chalampiao, a bit farther to the south. And then Bapot and Lao Lao Bay on the east coast. And then moving south from here to Tinian. The two early sites there are Unai Chulu on the northwest coast, and then the Taga House of Taga in the south. And then in Guam, we have three sites. There's Taragi and also Ritidian, both in the north. And then on the central east coast, around what's now the Manguilao Golf Course, is another early site. All of those sites I mentioned as the earliest Mariana sites have pretty much the same age according to their radiocarbon dating. So they're right at 3,500 years old.
So, many of the shorelines of the Marianas chain were settled as far back as 1.5 millennium before Christ. The early settlers seem to have settled in narrow coastal strips on several different islands.
At the time when people were living at the habitation that's right on the ancient shoreline, people also were accessing at least these two caves. This is the first of two caves. This isn't, the interior dark part of the cave. This is underneath this large overhang. The cave interiors were kept very, very clean of artifact, of food remained, even ash and charcoal. Having water is, a necessity in life. Fresh water floats above the salt water. What you retain is the ability to collect rainwater dripping, from these large, seedling exposures.
These early settlements were small, with between 5 and 20 houses located along a narrow beach area. Some of the early settlers may have even lived in caves.
We don't know exactly how many houses were in there and how many people per house. But if we had to guess, we would say there's probably about 100 people in each one of these early villages. Other sites like landward of the House of Taga in Tinian appear to be much larger than that, probably a few hundred people. But again, we're not exactly sure.
The houses were small and raised.
It seems the houses were built right at the water's edge.
These people, built their houses on posts, probably wooden posts at that time.
We found these arrangements of housing structures. The most obvious are these post molds that are lined with stones that would have braced in each post of the house. The other features we found are called hearths, and these are, rock oven features. So you have a wood fire, and that heats those stones, and then those stones radiate the heat back. So you're not cooking with the fire, you're cooking with the heat of the stone. The thing that's important for the first settlement in the Marianas at 1500 BC is where do people find their reliable drinking water, their fresh water sources. Rainwater is not enough to support a population year-round. So you need to have access to streams or seeps or caves or something that has fresh water. Limestone is not good for holding water. Rainwater drains through it very quickly, but you have a giant aquifer. So if you have a way of accessing it through seeps or in caves or in some way, then you can have a successful early settlement in those islands.
You must have a freshwater source. They actually have freshwater caves, and also you can still see evidence that they dug wells.
The main concern of these earliest migrants in their choice of where to live seems to be proximity to the sea for adequate fish and marine resources.
The people actually had plenty of protein because they had the ocean. They collected huge quantities of shellfish, which would have been an easy protein. It didn't require a lot of work to collect those shellfish. And also, they were excellent fishermen.
We have a lot of evidence that the early people were favored going after the pelagic species, the big open water fish species.
People very likely ate seaweed as a source, of nutrition. Seaweeds are, part of the diet in many Pacific Island groups.
Besides the nearby marine resources, the ancient settlers depended on other foods.
The kinds of foods that we know people ate during later periods would include different kinds of breadfruit, with the seed and without the seed, like the Federico palm or the fatang. Possibly different types of sago palm that have, a starch that you can eat. The dog, the seeded breadfruit, is endemic to the Mariana Islands. Unseeded breadfruit, the lemai, must have come from somewhere else. Some of those plants must have been imported from elsewhere.
We know people must have gone inland to access different kinds of geological sources. At the very earliest period, people were aware of all of the different geological formations and which of those were useful for them. People must have explored the environment rather thoroughly. Also for hunting fruit bats and birds.
They go into the interior on gathering missions to collect specific plant species or to hunt birds or to gather clays for making pottery.
The early settlers found some basic edible plants in the islands, and they may have brought with them other food crops, such as yam, sugarcane, bananas, seedless breadfruit or lemai, and mango. But there was no trace of animal bones at the earliest sites.
There weren't any large land mammals in the Mariana Islands until after the Spanish came.
In many Pacific islands, the first people brought with them pig, dog, and chicken, and rats. But in the Marianas, we don't see any of that. If people did bring those with them at an early time, then they just didn't survive.
They were eating fruit bat during the pre-latty period. We have found fruit bat bones at early sites. They were eating birds early on. They may have been consuming monitor lizards as well.
How did these early settlers cook their food? In the earth oven, or as it was known throughout the Pacific.
So they heat the stones and then put them in the ground, the food on top, and then more stones, more banana leaves to keep the heat, and then they would put sand on top or dirt and let it cook for hours and then unearth it.
The most distinctive mark of these early settlers was the pottery they made during this period. Hundreds of pieces of this pottery have been found by archaeologists.
The pottery prior to the latty period was very fine, decorated, small, mostly ceremonial use, and you will see designs made up of circles and lines, and slipped pottery. In other words, it's burnished. It has a painted mud finish on it.
Early pottery is very thin, it's beautiful. There's red slip pottery that's very colorful. There's the live press designs, quite artistic.
Pottery is small, it's like single serving size. They could be used for cooking, and they could be used for storage and presentation. They're not good for communal things, like with large numbers of people serving, because of their small size.
Other artifacts found in these early sites are made of chert, glassy polished rock, or stone. They include adze for chopping down trees, awls, chisels, and other cutting tools. Also fish hooks.
There's so many shell and stone tools as well as shell ornaments.
We found hundreds of small conch shell beads and also fragments of conch shell bracelets.
These settlers left other traces, the drawings found on the walls of caves at some of the early sites.
On 3 islands that I've surveyed to date, Saipan, Tinian, Rota, a higher number of these sites are coastal. They're not far from the waterline. There are a few images wherein they hold something akin to a shield. So you've got an extension of one arm and there's an item or a line. Might be a spear, might be a sword, but you've got that animation imbued in that image.
Most of them were painted with a chalky substance with white, the lime paste, on the walls of the caves. If the cave was dark background, then they painted or drew with this lime paste. In some cases, there was red, and in other cases, they would have used charcoal.
rock art is red, black, and white. That's what you see worldwide. But those colors in Chamorro are the colors that still have Chamorro names even today, and it tells you something about how important those colors are.
Over the centuries, the early population of the Marianas developed and changed. As the population grew and the need of agricultural land increased, people moved inland to utilize these resources.
When did people first move to settle the inlands permanently is a big question. During the latty period, definitely, and that's about the year AD 1000 when that started. But there's a little evidence earlier than that, about the 1st or 2nd century AD.
About 500 AD that we see them moving permanently inland, moving up the river valleys primarily, and settling the interior.
What happened at that time to make people move inland? Well, there's a number of things. One is steady population growth, and people just needed more land. The other is that sea level had been dropping, and so the coastal ecologies were different. So you couldn't support yourself entirely on a coastal ecosystem.
The move inland may have begun earlier, but was certainly hastened around 1100 BC as the sea level fell by nearly 6 feet.
And then it started to drop. Not all at once, completely, but it started to have what we call a period of drawdown. All this sand, close to the shoreline became stranded above sea level. So you have the sand up here, the water falling down, and this stranded berm or ridge of sand that are these elongate berms that become beach dunes, and people are inhabiting those.
The beach expanded greatly, but shellfish and other coastal resources the inhabitants depended upon became depleted.
And then people adjusted by focusing more on inland things. So about 2,500 years ago, people are focusing more on land-based resources than they did in the past. People couldn't eat the same kinds of foods that their ancestors did or what they were trained to do growing up. People start doing more inland things, using inland resources more heavily.
And to engage a little bit more in growing things like breadfruit and banana, taro, yams, more land-based food production instead of just, targeting the sea.
By 2,000 years ago, people are actually living in inland areas. Not everywhere, but a few inland sites, relying more on tree crops and root or tuber foods.
We see that archaeologically about the 1st or 2nd century AD becoming quite strong, and then it just continues.
And so, the population expanded up the major river valleys inland, and the people were using the interior more and more for agriculture. As people moved inland, the things they made reflect this change. Long after the first settlement, between 500 BC and 500 AD, people developed a new type of pottery.
This is the bottom, and this is the wall, this is the angle. And this would have been a big pot that would have only had a wall about so high. We have some evidence that these were used in earth ovens, perhaps to cook a wetter food, or perhaps to make salt.
It's interesting, all over Southeast Asia and the Pacific really, early pottery tends to be thin and carefully made and decorated. Late pottery tends to be thick and by our standards rather crude and just basically functional. Probably felt it wasn't necessary to spend too much time making the pot really thin. They just made the pottery for functional purposes and they just get thicker and thicker.
The initial ones were small and very decorative, highly decorative. Is that utilitarian, these initial vessels that were produced, or was it purely for spiritual or ritual purposes? Then they transition into the more blunt, the cruder latty period. They were bigger pots, they were thicker pots with thicker walls.
At some point, the people living here began to cultivate rice.
One of the biggest questions in archaeobotany is about rice. When did rice first get to the Mariana Islands? One idea is that rice came to the Mariana Islands about 1,000 years ago. Rice could have been here much older than that.
It may not have been 1000 AD, it may have been perhaps 500 years before that rice first made its way here.
They could take a segment of bamboo with the node, put the rice inside, put water in, put a leaf over the top, put it in a fire, and the rice would cook. The rice would boil. I mean, of course, the bamboo would eventually burn away, but the rice would boil before the bamboo burnt through. And that is very, very common in Southeast Asia.
Meanwhile, the people were developing more and more cultural features of their own. The skeletons of people who lived at that time, the earliest skeletons we have, reveal that many people blackened their teeth.
We also have found a number of cases of the teeth being incised with different patterns, which is a rarity.
Front teeth were decorated, perhaps with turtle shell, after they were incised.
Early people did do something that was fascinating, though they filed down their front teeth down to their nerve endings. It must have been such a painful thing.
A very distinctive thing to link the earliest settlers to the Philippines is inlaid incisors. Nobody knows what the inlay was. They were cutting their incisors in a round circle, and it's assumed that they were putting something in there for decoration.
Excavation at old grave sites reveal that the bodies of certain prominent people, especially women, were adorned with shell necklaces before burial.
A pre-latty woman had a dozen tiger shark teeth, and she also had 2 different kinds of cone shell beads and a fish hook and a nice little file made out of pumice. That was around 500 BC.
Mortars and pestles were also important tools at that time.
They're used for processing all kinds of different things, nuts, rice, pigments. You could mash other kinds of things in there too, like taro or yam if you wanted. Before that, what did people use? Well, probably wooden boards and wooden pestles. We believe that the more ancient mortar and pestle complex in the Marianas was primarily made of wood.
Life might have been short and difficult for most of the inhabitants, but it was not without some marks of dignity. This we can surmise from the remains we have found.
Those ornaments beautified the people when they were living or when they were deceased. Ornaments might be sort of a status symbol. Ornaments also say something about the identity of the person.
These mysterious seafarers sailed, perhaps from eastern Indonesia, but more likely from the Philippines, over 1,000 miles on the open ocean to settle in the Marianas between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. They settled in the Marianas long before any other part of the Pacific was inhabited, except Papua New Guinea. They chose to live along the shore in houses raised on wooden posts. Nearby caves were part of their habitat. They continued to produce the fine pottery they had brought from Asia, made stone and shell ornaments, and lived largely on marine foods. We know little about them other than this, but they were true pioneers. Around 1000 AD, new features appear in the Marianas. Significant changes in settlement patterns and lifestyle began to occur about this time.
By the time of the latty period, by the year AD 1000, let's say, population had been increasing in the Marianas for 2,000 years or more already. So by that time, there's a large number of people, and they needed places to live. There's also an increasing dependence on plant foods, which means people needed land. So by the latty period, by about the year 1000 AD, we see a large movement into the island interiors and uplands. And we see people living permanently for the first time in the northern Marianas, north of Saipan, in the Ghani.
Then by 1,000 years ago, people living everywhere in all of the islands north to south in the Marianas. So we have coastal and inland habitations in every island by the latty period.
The people changed somewhat. The adornment that they have found in burials and in the implements that have been found. A good example is that pottery, how it changed so drastically.
There was a change in the ornaments between the pre-latty period and the latty period. And during the pre-latty period, what the people loved in the way of ornaments was cone shell beads. During the latty period, what people loved was spondylus.
Thus began what became known as the latty period. It was named for the gigantic latty stones that started to appear at that time.
Earlier in the Marianas, we know people are making wooden house posts. Latty stones themselves would be a formalization of house making into stone.
The Marianas was not the only place this was happening.
This is found throughout the Pacific at 1,000 years ago. People moving into stone monuments in a big way. You have non-Madol in the eastern Micronesia. You have the stone and earthen, mounds for catching pigeons in Samoa and Tonga. You have the many stonework structures throughout Polynesia for religious purposes.
We have the latty stones here. We have the stone money in Yap. We have non-Madol in Pohnpei. We have the egg-shaped stones in Palau with the carved human facial features. We have terracing in Palau. In Koshrai, you have in Leilu Island, you have possibly the precursor to non-Madol. So these monoliths, and this goes all the way east to Easter Island.
It's a pan-Pacific, shift about 1,000 years ago.
Where did the latty stones come from? One explanation is that everything associated with this revolution was brought to the Marianas in a single wave of migration, perhaps from Sulawesi or elsewhere in Indonesia. But Mike Carson and other recent archaeologists believe that latty pillars and capstones are not found anywhere else in the world.
The latty are unique to the Mariana Islands, so this is a local invention as far as we know.
By this time, the population had grown and was beginning to show some of the marks of social status.
The latty period has structured villages all over the place on every island, coastal and inland. So people are definitely living in large numbers and density during the latty period, which means there's a need for more food at that time and a need to produce more things, more houses, more pottery, more of everything.
By the latty period, there was definite people associated with land areas. Lineages had their villages, in the latty period.
Latty stones appear in the more prominent coastal villages, although others are found inland. One small latty site is even found on Pagan.
The latty stones themselves started out very small. They were either made of basalt or mostly coral in the beginning. The early latty occurred around, they started seeing them about 800 AD. When they dated them, the bigger ones seemed to be more recent until the Western contact, and then that was the end of the latty period. Always associated with the latty is the lusum, which was the grinding stone that they ground food and medicine, root crops, under the houses.
Latty stones, lusong, and some of the larger shell ornaments from this period are features of a cultural revolution that began just 1,000 years ago, but they have become symbolic of Chamorro culture today. Was this cultural revolution introduced by another people in a new wave of migration?
According to the genetic evidence that Miguel Villar obtained, it looks like there were two different groups, the early pre-Latty people and then a long time later, the Latty people.
They were very robust people, thick necks, that sort of thing. And the smaller, darker people were in the interior.
You don't see that robusticity in the early people. The early people look more gracile, less robust.
Others maintain that the cultural revolution of the Latty period was just an outgrowth of a society that had been started in these islands thousands of years earlier by the original settlers. Whatever the case, we must look much further back than the Latty period to explain the real beginnings of the people of the Marianas, between 2,000 and 3,000 years earlier, to a sea people who made a canoe voyage of unprecedented length to found a home in a part of the world that had never been settled. They were the first inhabitants, these people about whom we know only the little left behind in their settlement sites. They sailed a vast distance, converted an uninhabited island into a home, and founded a culture that has continued with many modifications up to the present.